They called her La Madrina, the godmother of cocaine, a brutal drug lord who crushed anyone who stood in her way.
There were executions happening right and left.
She built a narcotics empire in the city of Miami.
Miami had become the capital of cocaine.
And ignited the cocaine cowboy drug wars.
It's like one of those scenes you might see in Vietnam.
Bodies were stacking up.
The ultimate Black Widow.
She was the Black Widow because if you crossed her, you were dead.
She even planned to kidnap John F. Kennedy Jr. Before Pablo Escobar, before El Chapo, there was the cocaine godmother. Griselda Blanco was notorious. In the criminal underworld, the cocaine business has traditionally been ruled by a handful of brutal men. Men such as Pablo Escobar and El Chapo became legendary for their cunning and ruthlessness. But one of the most cold-blooded, calculating drug lords of all time, an ice-veined killer who preceded them, was a 5-foot-tall woman named Griselda Blanco, a vicious queenpin who revolutionized the drug trade, and in the process became notorious. In 1979, the world was transformed by a series of events that changed the face of politics. In Iran, the Shah was overthrown in a political revolution and replaced by the Ayatollah Khomeini. In Great Britain, conservatives swept into power and Margaret Thatcher became prime minister. And in Nicaragua, President General Anastasio Somoza Debayle, under extreme pressure from the Sandinistas, resigned his office and fled to Miami, Florida, a city itself that was undergoing significant change. The once sleepy city, a popular destination for tourists and retirees, was becoming a smoldering tinderbox of action, ready to burst into flame. Neon signs and glittering nightclubs had sprung up around the city, and cocaine had become the drug of choice, its usage spreading like wildfire.
The explosion of cocaine use in Miami in the late 70s and early 80s was the perfect storm. South America and Colombia had started to mass produce cocaine, and they overwhelmed the town in terms of coke, dealers, partying, and development. Everything was just right, and then Miami became the distribution point for the rest of the country. It was cocaine central.
For the select few that fought their way to the top of the drug trade, untold millions awaited them.
It was just a pagan world, and it belonged entirely to those who were willing to go for it and take it.
One of those who saw Miami as virgin territory ripe for the taking was Griselda Blanco. Nicknamed the cocaine godmother, Blanco established herself as a drug queenpin and earned a reputation as one of the most violent drug dealers in the world. She had countless enemies and was known for her ruthlessness in eliminating them.
Because she was a woman, many people believe that there would be a soft spot, something motherly about her. You could get to her in some way. She wanted to disabuse anybody of that notion by becoming even more extremely violent.
By some estimates, she was responsible for more than 250 murders.
She had to show herself as being absolutely at all points without any compassion.
The word is criminally insane, sociopath.
George Young was a partner in the Medellin drug cartel and was the inspiration for Johnny Depp's character in the biopic Blow. While serving a prison sentence in 1974 for marijuana trafficking, Young struck up a friendship with a young Colombian drug dealer named Carlos Leder. The friendship would lead to Young's induction into the Medellin drug cartel, which in turn would land Young a nearly 20-year prison sentence. Before his incarceration, Young met Blanco in the early 1970s at the start of her career.
I met her in Queens, New York in the beginning. It was obvious to me that she didn't mind killing 3 or 4 people in one night.
To carry out her deadly assassinations, Blanco employed ruthless hitmen who she called Los Pistoleros, or the gunmen. In July of 1979, Los Pistoleros unleashed terror on South Florida's largest public mall.
Ralph, the shootout occurred at about 2:30 this afternoon when two or more Latin males entered the Crown Liquor Store here on the west end of the Dadeland Mall.
She sent out two hitmen to kill two rivals. The two rivals are at a place called Crown Liquors. The two gunmen go up in a van.
They were driving a simple white van. It looked like a regular commercial vehicle, but it was far from it. Its sides were covered with quarter-inch steel with gun ports cut into them. Now, those inside the vehicle could look out, but the one-way glass prohibited outsiders from looking in.
They open up the back door of this white van, and they literally fire from the back of the van into the store to kill the two rivals. And then on their way out of the mall, they continue to fire hundreds of rounds from automatic weapons from the back of the van as they leave the mall, spraying the entire mall. It was pandemonium.
Yesterday, they struck busy Dadeland shopping mall, hitting two employees and spraying the parking lot with bullets.
Keep in mind, this is in the middle of the day at a shopping center. These type of murders only occurred in gangster movies, not in real life. However, for the next 5 years, this would be real life in Miami.
The Dadeland Mall massacre would become part of pop culture lore after a police officer on the scene dubbed the hitmen the Cocaine Cowboys. For Blanco, the Dadeland shootings were only the beginning. In Miami, there was room for only one kingpin, and Blanco was determined it would be her. Blanco gave her enforcers strict orders. Any rival drug pusher dealing in the streets was to be gunned down.
If your beat in Miami was to cover the drug issues, you were a very busy reporter. Simply keeping up with the murder count in Miami was practically a full-time occupation. Even disposal of bodies became something that would actually have a backup.
It was a completely out-of-control city, and that's where Griselda thrived.
That Blanco could be so merciless was puzzling to many, but those who knew her say her cold-blooded ambition came from a tough childhood where even children sometimes had to be ruthless to survive.
Blanco was born into a poor family in a poor part of Colombia. She did not really know her father, and her mother was abusive towards her. It was not a very good start to her childhood.
Blanco's childhood is the same childhood that tens of thousands of young girls have in the poorest areas of cities in Central and South America. She happened to be in Colombia, born in Cartagena on the north coast, and then she moves when she's 3 years old with her mother into Medellin.
A crumbling economy, government corruption, and newfound demand for cocaine in North America led to the rise of the ruthless Medellin cartel based in Medellin, Colombia.
The drug cartels ran absolutely everything.
80% of the international cocaine trade is headquartered here. Take away the cocaine dollar, and this city's foundations would crumble.
Residents were well aware of the cartel's presence. Many would unwillingly participate in gang activity to avoid putting a target on their own back.
Griselda Blanco's abusive mother took up with unscrupulous men, at least one of which raped young Griselda.
She just wasn't abused a couple of times and it stopped. This went on every day as a child, every day of her childhood. Who's to say if that happened to any one of us? What would we be like?
She was determined to get out of that at any cost. And at 11, as the story goes, she was involved in a kidnapping of a child for ransom.
Blanco is said to have masterminded the kidnapping of a child, which was one of the easiest ways to make money in Medellin. But when the child's parents failed to pay the ransom, Griselda is said to have shot the boy in the head.
She actually ended up killing that child. Here's what's interesting. When you look into it, you can't confirm whether that's true, but there's one thing that's undeniable. That became part of her legend. So as she continued to move up in the drug world, all of her competitors knew this was the woman who at 11 had killed a child in a kidnapping. She takes no prisoners. So whether true or not, it was true in that it added to her tough woman edge and persona, so it worked for her.
At 14 years old, Blanco ran away from home and lived on the streets of Medellin, surviving at first as a pickpocket.
After a few years of being a pickpocket, Blanco realized that it wasn't enough anymore. As she was getting older and maturing, she learned that being a prostitute could earn her even more money. And that was the next step in her criminal career.
Remember, we're talking about South America in the early 1950s. As a young girl, your options were limited, and Blanco looked around and everyone who was successful was involved in crime. So that was her way out.
She was a victim of her environment as a child.
While working the streets, at 13 years old, she met a young man named Carlos Trujillo, a small-time criminal whose specialty was forging documents and smuggling illegal immigrants into the United States. Griselda saw Trujillo's business as a big step up. In 1960, she and Trujillo married. Over the course of their nearly decade-long relationship, they would have 3 sons, Dixon, Uber, and Osvaldo. In the early 70s, 9 years after marrying Trujillo, Blanco met Alberto Bravo, a cocaine smuggler working for the fledgling Medellin drug cartel.
It's unclear if Blanco had begun an affair with Alberto Bravo or if her relationship with Trujillo had simply run its course. But a short time after that, they were divorced. They tried to maintain a business relationship, but that got rocky pretty quickly with repeated arguments.
There are still rumors that Blanco had Trujillo killed after a business dispute.
She had no qualms about killing people. She had just abandoned all morality as we know it, because as a child, she existed in a world with no morality.
Violence was a part of her life. She was desensitized to violence because of the abuse she endured. She knew what it took to survive. And if it meant killing somebody, then it meant killing somebody. That's just the way it was.
With Trujillo out of the way, Blanco was free to move on with Bravo. In her new man, Griselda saw an opportunity for a new way of life. She was on the path to building a cocaine empire, one that would make her notorious. Raised in the slums of Medellin, Colombia, Griselda Blanco had grown into a cold-blooded killer. Her rise to drug queenpin has been the subject of numerous films, including the 2006 documentary Cocaine Cowboys and the 2017 Lifetime television movie Cocaine Godmother, starring Catherine Zeta-Jones. The violent, cocaine-laden Miami Blanco helped create was also the inspiration for the 1980s TV series Miami Vice. But no fictional depiction could come close to capturing the merciless brutality of the notorious Griselda Blanco. Once she'd ordered a successful hit on her first husband after a drug dispute, Blanco's next relationship was with Alberto Bravo, who was working for the fledgling Medellin drug cartel. Bravo recruited Blanco to purchase unrefined cocaine, which he then processed in his empty garment factories.
In short order, they established their own drug operation that was working hand in hand with the Medellin cartel.
Blanco and Bravo married and moved to the United States with Blanco's 3 sons. They settled in Queens, New York.
They moved to New York. Why? Because it is, after all, America, the land of opportunity. And it's the land of opportunity not only for people who want to make a legitimate fortune, but the land of opportunity for drug dealers as well.
In Medellin, Bravo had been a small-time criminal, but in New York, Blanco saw an opportunity for something bigger.
They have something that nobody else has. They have the source for cocaine.
The couple began dealing cocaine in the U.S. With a direct line to Colombian powder, their operation took off. The move made Griselda Blanco the first Colombian drug lord to export the Medellin cartel's product to the United States, years before Pablo Escobar would follow in her footsteps. Business was so good that Blanco's biggest challenge was figuring out how to smuggle in enough cocaine to meet demand.
The trick, of course, was smuggling the drugs into the country. Customs and drug agents would confiscate drugs that were found in suitcases. However, Griselda was cunning and developed innovative ways to bring the drugs in. She owned several lingerie shops in Medellin, and so she designed underwear that could in fact hide the cocaine. And she sent women, on commercial flights into the United States, and they hid in their underwear cocaine. It was ingenious.
Each mule, drug mule, coming over the border could bring up to half a pound of cocaine in hidden places along the underwear, along the underwire of the bra. You're talking about kilos of coke coming in regularly. She was doing that on a daily basis.
In a few short years, Blanco and Bravo's business was trafficking thousands of kilos of cocaine and earning millions of dollars a month. But in 1975, authorities caught on to Blanco's drug-running ring. NYPD and federal agents formed an undercover sting operation called Operation Banshee. Not long after, the U.S. Attorney's Office indicted 39 people, including Blanco and Bravo.
They indict nearly a dozen of them, and they're ready to bring her down. It looks like the end of Griselda Blanco. If I looked at her when she was indicted, I'd say that's the end of her career. She's going away for a long time.
But Griselda Blanco had no intention of going to prison. The cocaine queen had a ready-made escape plan. A fully fueled private jet on 24-hour standby.
She didn't want to take any chances of being arrested, so it was time to, in fact, leave the United States and go back to Colombia.
The couple continued to run their drug operation from Bogota. Everything appeared to be operating normally, but when Blanco decided to take a closer look at the cartel's finances, she noticed some glaring discrepancies. Millions of dollars were missing. There was only one person who had had access to the money who could have stolen it: her husband.
She confronts him in a parking lot of a club about money that's missing in the business. The story is that she kills her husband and 6 of his bodyguards, and she's left standing. It was part and parcel of what she had to do to have her drug business, to protect it, to show that nobody else could come in on top of it, because the drug business is a nest of vipers. If you show any weakness, they'll take over your end of the trade.
Someone could have found out that they got over on her, that she was weak, and she could not have had that. That would have been the end of her career. Nobody could get over on her. Her husband, her brother, her sister, her friends. She had to be dominant, or she wouldn't be able to survive in this situation.
The merciless shootings of her second husband was one of the many episodes that, true or not, became part of Griselda Blanco's legend. With this killing, she had a new nickname, the Black Widow.
Griselda earned the name Black Widow, doing exactly what a Black Widow does. He makes love to its mate, and then she kills it.
In 1978, the Black Widow married again, this time to a bank robber named Dario Sepulveda. The couple had a son, Blanco's fourth. She named him Michael Corleone, after the Al Pacino character in The Godfather.
Don't ever take sides with anyone against the family again.
She named one of her children Michael Corleone, which speaks for itself as how she glorified this type of criminal lifestyle. This wasn't a 9-to-5 job where she dragged herself to work every day, hoping to someday she could retire with a pension. She loved what she did.
Blanco knew the big money was back in the U.S. She longed to return north. Miami was the closest major U.S. city.
Miami made the most sense. If you're smuggling cocaine in from Colombia, you can bring it into South Florida by boat or small plane and then distribute it from there.
There was just one problem with Blanco's plan. Blanco still had the 1975 indictment hanging over her head. To avoid law enforcement, Blanco had a forger on her payroll manufacture a Venezuelan passport.
Griselda comes in her real name, no one knows it, and she's ready for Act 2 of the Griselda Blanco show, which is Miami, Here I Am.
She arrived in Miami in the late 1970s, and her business grew exponentially.
She was making, at her height, about $80 million a month coming into her enterprise. She's making millions of dollars a month.
Standing barely 5 feet tall and weighing 165 pounds, Blanco did have an imposing presence. But for Griselda, actions spoke louder than words.
Blanco ran her organization using fear and violence. And when it comes to competition of other cartels trying to edge in and do the same kind of business, it's only a matter of time before people start dying on the streets. And that's exactly what happened when Blanco was running the show.
But with a brutal reputation for killing anyone who rivaled her, she made enemies easily. And some were out to get revenge on the notorious Griselda Blanco. Griselda Blanco had ruthlessly climbed to the top of the U.S. cocaine trade. Her victims included rival drug dealers, buyers, sellers, and even two of her husbands, earning her the nickname the Black Widow. After fleeing New York and returning to Colombia to avoid federal prosecution on trafficking charges, Blanco decided to stage a return to the U.S. She cast an eye towards the pastel-colored city of Miami, the entry point for much of the cocaine flowing into the country.
Miami had become the capital of cocaine. Miami, many say, was kind of the house that cocaine built.
The entire economy of South Florida in the 70s and 80s was fueled by cocaine money. Everybody knew it, and everybody looked the other way.
Nobody likes to talk about this in Miami because it's one of those things they say, oh, those are the bad old days. But if you look at the skyline of downtown Miami, the first wave of that skyline developed in the 70s and 80s. That skyline was originally built by cocaine.
But what was so interesting is that this is all happening in the backdrop of this beautiful, tropical palm tree, all that pink and aqua-colored stuff. And then there was this parallel universe that was deadly and dangerous.
Blanco employed Los Pistoleros to carry out her violent demands, led by her most trusted hitman, Jorge Rivi Ayala. The famous violent daytime hit at the Dadeland Mall liquor store was just the opening salvo in a bloody war between drug cartels, each one determined to control South Florida and the steady stream of cocaine flowing into the country. Griselda Blanco fought hard and ruthlessly for the top position.
Griselda Blanco destroyed anyone who got in her path. She was very savvy, and she quickly developed a more efficient way of killing her enemies.
She's the one credited with the motorcycle drive-by.
It's been copied in 100 movies since. The drive-by shooting on a motorcycle took place in Miami for the first time, where somebody will come up to you on a road, you're in the car next door, you look over for a second, that person takes out a MAC-10 pistol, fires into the car, and sprays it, and that's the end of it.
Blanco's reputation was very well known. She just didn't kill you, she sadistically killed you. When there was a drug murder, they would kill everybody in the family, including the pets. Everything was destroyed.
They were known for cutting the body open, letting the blood out of the body. Then the body could be compressed. They would fold the body to fit into a package and send it to their rivals. That was her trademark.
With tens of millions of dollars coming in from coke money, Blanco lived the decadent life of a drug lord. Her net worth was estimated at $2 billion.
She had mansions, penthouse apartments. She was on top of the world.
She loved emeralds and with the diamond clusters around them and this and that.
And she had a gold-plated MAC-10, which everybody needs, the machine pistol in solid gold plate. That was one of her favorite things. She spent her money on gangster goods, jewelry and gold guns.
Although Blanco was a disciplined and notoriously violent crime boss, she violated the cardinal rule of drug dealers: never use your own product.
She smoked what is known as bazooka, which is the base of the cocaine before it's processed into powder. It makes you crazy, it's very addictive, and makes you unstable.
High on bazooka, Griselda threw hedonistic parties where excessive behavior was the norm.
Griselda used to love to have sex parties, not trifectas, 10, 15 people all having sex together in these satanic rituals and this madness.
Sexual orgies, had all kinds of drugs and alcohol. Everything was to excess.
In Miami, everything was going according to plan. Blanco was raking in millions of dollars a month off of cocaine proceeds and had not yet attracted the attention of the feds. But that was all about to change.
Federal agents seized more than 4 tons of cocaine worth over $220 million after breaking into a shipping container. The contents looked innocent enough at first, hundreds of planks bound for a furniture factory. After sniffer dogs gave a positive reaction, the agents began breaking them open. Cleverly hidden in each one, 2 4-pound packets of cocaine. A spokesman said it was one of the most ingenious methods yet used by drug traffickers.
It was the largest cocaine seizure to date and forever changed the U.S. government's perception of the drug trade. In response to the seizure, President Ronald Reagan created the South Florida Drug Task Force.
What was happening in South Florida is an example of the increasing sophistication and power of organized criminal enterprises and the grave danger that they pose to our nation.
Vice President George Bush was tasked with coordinating a federal law enforcement response to the drug epidemic.
The time has come to cripple the power of the mob in America.
The FBI joined forces with the DEA, dramatically increasing the manpower and resources needed to pursue drug cases.
And they were doing everything and they could from a local, state, and federal nexus, even using the U.S. military and the Coast Guard to, in fact, try to curtail this scourge that was undertaking the city of Miami.
They knew that in order to stop the violence, they had to stop the profits that the trade was generating.
It wasn't long before Griselda Blanco found herself in the task force's crosshairs.
Not only was the federal government coming after Blanco, but other members of the cartel who Blanco had violently attacked were also seeking their revenge, and as a result, there were numerous assassination attempts made on Blanco's life.
Blanco's personal life was also in turmoil. Convinced that Dario was having an affair, Blanco confronted him, and they got into a custody battle over their son, Michael Corleone.
Maybe because of her history, Sepulveda took their 5-year-old son, Michael Corleone, and fled with him to Colombia. Griselda Blanco was furious.
Sepulveda thought they'd be safe back in Colombia, but according to Blanco's former henchmen, the Black Widow hired hitmen to pose as police and assassinate her husband.
No one was going to get the better of Griselda Blanco.
The henchmen told authorities that Sepulveda was driving home when assassins dressed as cops pulled him over. The officers opened fire, shooting Sepulveda repeatedly. Young Michael Corleone sat in the back seat of the car, screaming. After the hit was carried out, Corleone was smuggled back to Miami and returned to his mother.
Of course, no one was surprised by this. It was only a matter of time before the Black Widow would find more prey.
Blanco's constant cocaine use had increased her feeling of fear and paranoia. She felt her enemies closing, and in 1984 decided to flee South Florida altogether.
The heat was on, and Blanco knew she had to get out of town. Of all places, where did she choose to go? It was Irvine, California. She basically became a suburban mom at this point, and she could hide in plain sight among those who had no idea of her criminal and violent past.
Blanco's 3 oldest sons, Dixon, Uber, and Osvaldo, took over much of the day-to-day operations of the cartel.
They essentially split up the country, with Uber remaining in Miami, Dixon supervising in San Francisco, and Osvaldo running Los Angeles near his mother.
Little did the brothers know that a DEA informant had infiltrated their operation.
The informant was tracking financial transactions from the hits that she was ordering, and he was turning this information over to the DEA.
Brick by brick, the feds were building a powerful case against Blanco. In 1985, after unknowingly meeting with the informant, the DEA tracked Blanco back to her hideout. They waited for the perfect moment to strike.
This is the woman who had almost single-handedly been responsible for these bloody turf wars in Miami, who had killed numerous people herself, and who had ordered the executions of almost 200 other people. There was no reason to think that she was coming peacefully.
On the morning of February 17, 1985, agents watched as Blanco kissed her youngest son goodbye and went off to the park with the nanny.
They thought it was a perfect time to strike. They would catch her off guard.
The agents quickly surrounded the house. They discovered Griselda Blanco in the master bedroom, reading the Bible.
There was a gun on her night table next to her bed, but she didn't make any effort to retrieve it. She simply got up and let them handcuff her. She didn't say anything.
42-year-old Griselda Blanco was arrested and charged with multiple drug charges dating back to 1975. Prosecutors weren't done. They wanted a murder conviction, too. But getting enough evidence to charge Blanco with even one of the more than 200 murders she ordered was going to be a challenge. People were not in the habit of pointing the finger at Griselda Blanco.
The problems prosecutors have in a case like this is their witnesses. The witnesses are highly intimidated.
Would Griselda Blanco's notorious reputation be enough to save her from a life behind bars? In less than 20 years, Griselda Blanco had risen from the poverty-stricken streets of Colombia to queenpin of one of the world's largest drug smuggling operations. Working out of Miami in the late 1970s and early 80s, Blanco became the cocaine godmother.
She was extremely violent and aggressive and sadistic. She was just feared.
Blanco was a sociopathic lunatic.
Reportedly ordering 200 murders to protect her criminal empire, Blanco's operation was responsible for trafficking billions of dollars worth of cocaine into the U.S. Griselda Blanco's bloody, meteoric rise would eventually inspire books, documentaries, and a feature film starring Catherine Zeta-Jones. But in 1982, the game changed. Federal law enforcement got serious about stemming the tide of illegal drugs coming into the country. Overnight, Griselda Blanco went from hunter to hunted. Fleeing Miami, she settled in Irvine, California, and camouflaged into a typical middle-class lifestyle while raising her youngest son, Michael Corleone. But the illusion was shattered when federal agents raided her home in 1985. Charged with multiple counts of drug trafficking, the 42-year-old faced a potential prison sentence of 20 years. Now that prosecutors had her in their sights, would Blanco finally meet her end?
They strongly suspected that she was responsible for at least 200 murders. The question remained, however, whether prosecutors would be able to successfully charge her with these murders.
To begin a prosecution against her, they would need some kind of witnesses who would have credibility and be able to tell the truth about her. Unfortunately, no one was willing to do that because they knew it was basically signing their own death warrant.
They were afraid that she would look for revenge on anyone who testified against her. This is very, very frightening and very, very intimidating for a person who may have something to say against Blanco. And this is a real problem for prosecutors to bring a case like this. The witnesses all go away because they're afraid of being killed themselves or their families being killed.
Without any witnesses, federal prosecutors were forced to only seek convictions on narcotics trafficking charges. Blanco was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison. Knowing Blanco was trapped behind bars, rival gangs felt emboldened to take over her territory and settle old scores. In 1992, her son Osvaldo was gunned down in Medellin by a member of a rival cartel. Two of Griselda's other sons, Uber and Dixon, would also die from drug-related violence in Colombia.
She loved her children really more than anything. The only men she cared for in her life were her sons, and it really hurt her very, very much that she couldn't protect them while she was locked up.
While federal prosecutors had settled for drug trafficking charges to get Blanco behind bars, state prosecutors in Florida were still trying to bring additional charges against her.
The state attorney's office in Miami knew that Blanco would be eventually released on the drug charges. And so during Blanco's time in prison, the state office attempted to gather evidence to try and charge her with these numerous homicides that she had ordered.
The state authorities in Florida are working on a case to bring her back for murder. They want to charge her for 3 specific murders that she was personally involved with. She would go away in what they call a pine box sentence, meaning you're put into a pine box like a coffin, you're sent to prison, you're never seen again.
All they needed was one witness willing to testify against her. And in 1993, they finally found one. The Miami-Dade Police Department arrested one of Blanco's closest and most trusted associates, hitman Jorge Rivi Ayala.
Rivi had been one of the gunmen who was also suspected of being involved in at least 3 dozen homicides that were all ordered by Griselda Blanco.
Ayala confessed to his involvement in at least 3 murders that were ordered by Blanco. He was facing a lengthy prison sentence for his involvement in the killings. Prosecutors offered leniency in his sentence if he agreed to testify against Blanco. He accepted. When Blanco heard about the deal, she was stunned by the betrayal. Blanco was charged with 3 counts of murder. The man who had pulled the trigger in all 3 instances, Jorge Rivi Ayala, was set to testify that she gave the orders. Blanco drew up a desperate plan to save herself.
Blanco's arrest and conviction were obviously big news, and a crack dealer from Oakland, California, Charles Cosby, claims that he became enamored with her and began writing to her in prison.
Cosby and Blanco struck up a relationship while she was in prison.
He learned that Blanco still had pull in prison. Cosby claimed that he had struck up a romantic relationship with Blanco and that she had paid off prison guards so that they could become lovers.
One day while Cosby was visiting her in prison, she passed him a note that said JFK, 5M, and Y. Now Cosby didn't know what JFK, 5M, and Y meant, and so he asked her. And she told him, "I'm going to move on Kennedy."
Blanco's plan was to kidnap JFK Jr., who in 1995 was working as a prosecutor in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. She wanted Cosby to pay 4 Colombian men $5 million to snatch the famous son of the former president. Once they had Kennedy as a hostage, Blanco planned to trade him for her release.
She did not want to spend the rest of her life in prison, and she saw this as the only way to gain enough leverage to force the government to release her.
4 men were recruited from Colombia and flown into New York City. With the promise of $5 million, the men staked out the neighborhood where JFK Jr. lived. After several days of waiting, they caught him exiting the building with his dog.
The men got out of their car and moved into position, trying to surround him but not draw too much attention to themselves. One of the kidnappers got close enough to make small talk and even pet JFK Jr.'s dog's head.
But just as they were about to make their move, they were scared off by an NYPD squad car that just happened to be passing by. After the narrow miss, the kidnappers waited days for another opportunity, but JFK Jr. never reappeared. The men eventually grew discouraged and flew back to Colombia.
The whole idea was ludicrous and they knew it. Where were they going to go? What were they going to do with him?
Fearing Griselda's desperate plans would eventually land him behind bars, Cosby severed ties with Blanco. With her escape plan botched, it appeared the notorious Griselda Blanco had finally ran out of luck. Griselda Blanco rose from the mean streets of Medellin, Colombia, to become the cocaine godmother, a bloodthirsty drug lord who ruled over South Florida with an iron fist. After more than 2 decades at the helm of a Colombian cartel, Griselda Blanco was in prison for narcotics trafficking. And prosecutors in Miami believe they finally had the witnesses they needed to convict the cocaine godmother of murder. Blanco's most prolific hitman was set to testify against her. In July 1995, 10 years after her initial arrest, Blanco was indicted on 3 counts of murder, with prosecutors aiming for the death penalty. But a scandal erupted in the Miami-Dade State Attorney's Office that ruined the prosecution's case.
Jorge Rivi Ayala claimed that he had had phone sex on numerous occasions with several secretaries at the office. It was completely outlandish.
For Blanco's defense attorneys, the revelations were an unexpected gift. They now could argue to exclude Ayala's testimony on the basis that he was biased in favor of the prosecution.
That automatically threw his testimony out the window. It could not be used in front of a jury because the person would have been challenged in terms of his relationship with the prosecutor.
With the credibility of the 2 key prosecution witnesses compromised, the murder case against Blanco was now in tatters.
The problem was, without Rivi Ayala, there wasn't much of a case. Griselda Blanco rarely pulled the trigger in these murders. She gave the orders to pull the trigger, and that's what she did with Ayala. So his testimony, his credible testimony, it was gone, and with it, the case.
Recognizing that a jury might vote to acquit, the prosecutor offered Blanco a plea deal in which she would be spared the death penalty and get credit for time already served.
It was an awful deal for the state. Blanco agreed to serve 20 years, but with the time that she'd already served, she'd be out on the streets in just 7 years.
After serving 19 years in prison, Blanco was released in 2004. Federal officials were on hand to have her immediately deported back to her native Colombia.
There was no way they were going to let the cocaine godmother spend one more second on U.S. soil. They wanted to be rid of her and her violent legacy.
Given the enemies she had made during Miami's cocaine wars, many felt Blanco would be dead within days of her arrival back in Colombia.
Every one of those people that she killed when she was in the drug trade had a wife or husband or children who were after Griselda Blanco. She had so many enemies, it wasn't funny. She didn't have to be in the drug trade anymore for somebody to want her dead.
But when Blanco returned to Colombia, the bloody reception many predicted didn't materialize, and she settled into a quiet, comfortable existence until the summer of 2012. 69-year-old Blanco was sitting on a bench in a Medellin butcher shop when a man on a motorcycle pulled up outside. He shot her twice in the head before speeding off. She died instantly.
The irony, of course, is she was killed by the very assassination method that she herself created, the motorcycle drive-by hit.
And Griselda Blanco goes out a victim of the violence that she had sort of engineered herself for so long. Somebody returned the vengeance to her on that day in September 2012. The queenpin died in her 60s in the most ignoble fashion that you could imagine.
A lot of people are killed by the movements they invent. That's the poetic justice of our existence on this planet.
Some people believe that she was behind at least 200 murders, including 3 ex-husbands. She left a path of death and destruction. That was her legacy.
Say what you want about Griselda Blanco, but she was certainly a self-made woman. She came from nothing in the streets of Medellin, learned how to become a petty criminal, killing at an early age, realizing violence was the way to resolve many of her problems, and carried that through her for the rest of her life. There's no doubt she killed many people, committed many crimes, and affected many others with her distribution of cocaine in the United States and throughout the world during the 1980s.
Very few of us look back and see that much evil.
She stands out in immense business for accomplishing something that no other woman did at the time. She was a pioneer, not the type of pioneer we necessarily want, but a pioneer in the drug trade.
The blind ambition, unrestrained greed, and murderous evil of Griselda Blanco rose her to the top of the cocaine trade and cemented her spot as one of the most notorious criminals of the 20th century.